this, and there we go. Okay, so in a couple of weeks, as I mentioned, I'm down in San Diego and I'm talking at the Summit of Neurodegenerative Diseases. I'll be really honest, it took me, I've had MS 22 years, it took me at least 10 to get my head around the fact that I had a neurodegenerative disease, because it doesn't sit well in one's sight, as I'm sure you can all attest. In fact, you know, this is their first one. They've had some incredibly successful integrated medicine for mental health conferences, and they've expanded it to brain health. And my topic this year, a moderately challenging one, but you're going to get the flavors of it, because in some ways this is a practice run, although I've given parts of the talk in the last couple of weeks. For not just MS, but also ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease, as you might call it, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. So what do they happen to all have in common? So that part we can tell you. The FRCPC, that's the same as comes after a neurologist designation. Mine happens to be for anesthesiology. You get the sound?
Other way.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay, I have no commercial disclosures. I had put on, but I'm giving this in the United States, so I had to sanitize it because I had taken one honorarium from a cannabis company, but I didn't think it would show well in the same game.
I didn't want to get escorted out.
Well, or not get in. Okay, so most of the neurodegenerative diseases we know are aggravated, triggered, or aggravated by toxic chemicals and neurotoxins. And then I talked to some degree about strategies of testing, because many of the next group will be clinicians, but some of the things will apply to you if you want them to. Sandra had alluded earlier to an MS nutrition study we did on very comprehensive labs on a dozen MS patients, and we got several clues from that that most of us do not appreciate or realize. And fortunately, I've just finished the book after 3 years of working on it. I'm very proud of it, actually. It's the best thing I've ever done. It's double the size of the previous book. But there's great understanding now to what there was. And just because your own particular physician or neurologist doesn't know that, doesn't mean it exists. It doesn't exist. There's over 450 references in the book, so I applaud any of you that have the wisdom to purchase it. It won't be very available till the new year. So, of course, we needed learning objectives if you're going to talk to docs. But here is one of the key slides you must realize. Blood flow in the brain is critical. It's the forerunner or first step in all 4 illnesses I mentioned previously. All 4. So Parkinson's and Alzheimer's as well. Okay? Because the blood flow provides oxygen, as the critical source. If you take nothing away today than this, more oxygen is good. Okay? Glucose, lipids, because you can use either one for fat, either fat or sugar for energy. And of course, amino acids, which are the building blocks of repair and so on. It also eliminates the soluble proteins, including the beta amyloid, which is the abnormally folded protein of both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Okay? It helps take those away, and of course it helps take away heavy metals and pesticides or any other unhappy toxins you took in. Very important, it obeys Poiseuille's law. So, he showed that the radius of a tube is related to the fourth power of the radius to fix flow. So if you cut the size of a tube in half, flow goes down to 1/16. So that's an incredibly important deal. The vasculature I want you to really think about is hard for you to imagine, but it's the stuff We call it microvasculature because you mostly see it under a microscope. It's from about 5 microns to 100 microns. So 100 microns is 0.1 millimeters. So you guys know that that's fairly small. It's about the head of a pin ballpark. Okay? So it's down at that level that the oxygen exchange occurs, the other nutrients occurs, the toxins leaving occur. The other thing that the blood vessels do, the endothelium, which is the lining of the blood vessels, is the blood-brain barrier. Okay? So you want it intact. You want it working well. And I think we're going to get maybe a flavor on microbes today, aren't we, David? Maybe.
A couple slides, sure.
Yeah, awesome. David and I, fortunate enough, we've talked at meetings before, but the endothelium, everybody, including all the neurologists today, agree on 2 things. MS, for example, is a spike of inflammation within a part of the brain. They all agree on that. They also agree with the rest of us that the problem is a leaky blood-brain barrier. What we can't seem to agree on, because they won't look at the new data, is that it's a matter of how much that works that makes the difference. They suggest the problem is autoimmune, and it's the white cells attacking. What we suggest is it's injury to the endothelium. Injury we'll get to in a minute. But the white blood cells in MS, converging so-called at the point, is mostly in a clean up the garbage mode. There is no more white blood cells in an MS area or lesion than there is in a stroke. So take some clues from that, a couple. Okay, so now I'm going to try and help you build a case in your mind. Maybe there is a vascular health connection between MS and that. So this is the US Department of Defense claims database. So they had big numbers. They had over 15,000 MS patients, and they had over 78,000 controls. So if you want to get numbers out of epidemiology, that's a nice big number to start with. Okay? They all cause mortality 2.9 or nearly 3 times normal. And it's almost always secondary to infection. Most of you have lost friends with pneumonia and everything else. Central nervous system diseases, respiratory, and circulatory. Okay? You go into comorbidities. So these are people that have both illnesses, MS and stroke. Your risk of stroke is 4 times normal if you have MS. That means a lot to me, okay? Not only that, I'm going to be helping you make a case in your mind. One of the triggers to MS is like a miniature stroke, okay? Because if you get an irritant, whether it's from leaky gut, in an LPS, a lipopolysaccharide molecule, but a fat emboli, a little small one in those blood-brain barrier endotheliums, is enough to irritate it and help it break down if there is not quite enough oxygen present. That makes it vulnerable. Okay? So ischemic stroke, suicide attempt, and completion, actually, I mean, I've lost a few friends, close friends to MS. They were starting to get huge cognitive problems and didn't want to go there. And since we've had physician-assisted suicide in Canada, in recent years, lost a few more friends through that. Because they saw no hope at the end of the tunnel. And my goal with writing the book is to give people hope back. Too frequently we get it taken away, saying nothing more can be done. That just means that that individual knows nothing more to help. It doesn't mean that you're done. You can do a lot yourself. Ulcerative colitis, twice normal. 70% of people with MS have irritable bowel syndrome. Okay? Really a common theme. And ulcerative colitis, has some parallels. Cancer, over twice as common. I suspect part of that data has come from us using, the rebifs and the beta-seron, the drugs, which literally suppress the immune system. You cannot suppress the immune system without some bad effects. And one of them will be the immune system's ability to control all those several thousand new cancer cells per day. Usually it looks after. But if you hit it over the head bad enough with a hammer, it may not look after all of them, and you're going to get more cancer. Another study, this one done in Sweden this time, showing that after you're been diagnosed with MS, you have a very high risk of cardiovascular disease. So heart attack or myocardial infarction nearly twice as common. In that study, stroke was getting close to twice as common. Heart failure, twice as common. So what's the commonality between MS and heart failure? Injury to the energy packet making part of the cell, the mitochondria, is the common factor. So the fatigue of MS is identical to fatigue of the heart, which is congestive heart failure, which we have relatively little treatment for, although all the things that help the energy production within the cell, and I've got a major chapter on the mitochondria, and mentioned the Minding the Mitochondria by Terry Walls a few years ago, because it was a good way to look at it, and also included in that is a set of supplements will make a difference. I was lucky enough to hear Dr. Mark Houston, I think I've got one of his slides up later, but a few years ago in Boston, the most brilliant cardiologist I'd ever listened to, and I've heard a fair number, but he had got 3 people off the heart transplant list with 3 key supplements. And those were, carnitine, better if you've got MS, acetylcarnitine, as well as D-ribose, a sugar, which helps one of the pathways, and coenzyme Q2. So atrial fibrillation was relatively more common, and this risk was always especially so in women. Part of the issue and challenge that women have 3 to 4 times as much MS as men might literally be a size of the blood vessel problem. Remember, a smaller vessel carries, if it's half as small, it carries 1/16 the flow. So they may be more vulnerable to those regions of relative lack of oxygen or hypoxia. Just to put it in, we already had mercury mentioned today about all of mine out. Almost 20 years ago now, I've had MS for 22. And Bill Shaw, who runs Great Plains Labs down in Kansas, he's quite convinced that that was one of my steps of recovery, because I had a major mouthful of mercury. But he goes on to talk about it, how it's a huge factor in hypertension, stroke, and cardiovascular diseases, not just the brain trouble of the mercury. I hate statins. That's the short progress. To bring in Parkinson's disease, it doubles your risk of Parkinson's disease. Statins do. At the same time, it increases memory problems, including Alzheimer's. Okay? So it's a matter of, they're not good drugs. 20 years from now, maybe sooner, but probably not, we'll say we should never have used those drugs. If your doctor has prescribed statins for you and not put you on coenzyme Q10 at the same time, they don't know what they're talking about. So you don't have to listen to them about statins, because when you take a statin, it blocks the pathway where our body can make coenzyme Q10, and you will not be healthy without it. So a long time ago, can lifestyle, what you eat and your exercise, can it reverse coronary disease? And it can. This is published by Dean Ornish in a really good journal, The Lancet, in 1990. This is not new news, but we've reproved it many times since. So this is a quote from Jaroslav Lakovic. I was lucky enough to hear him first in Bologna, Italy, in the big early heydays of CCSVI and the work in Italy. The meeting was in Bologna, Italy, and this speaker was from New York at the time. Now he's in Los Angeles, California. But he talked about the first step in this one is talks about ALS, but at that meeting he talked the first step of Alzheimer's was blood vessel problems. That's what comes first, okay? The other stuff is just later, the later, of course, the harder to reverse. He talked about up to 45% of all dementias are wholly or partly due to age-related small vessel disease. Remember, 5 to 100 microns. Just for reference point, a red blood cell is 7 microns. So it has to squeegee up a little bit to get through a 5 micron tube. And now he works on AD, but he focuses on the endothelium. That's the lining of the blood vessel. We can't say that the endothelium is not the vascular part, because it's the lining itself, and it's also, of course, the blood-brain barrier. And it impacts all of those. So, this is an article. When I went to the same International Society of Neurovascular Diseases time in New York, so it would have been the spring of 2016, okay? So, it had been put together by one of the people that I highly regard, Salvatore Sclafani. But at this meeting, there was a neurologist talking about the problem of MS, and had written a book about it. And the book was quite comprehensively, went heavily into the drug story. And he restated again that MS is a problem with leaky blood-brain barrier and a problem with inflammation at the focused site. So I was lucky enough to ask the first question, and he said, is it possible that hypoxia is the trigger to that all starting up? And he said, I was surprised actually, he said, you might be right. So I was flabbergasted because I hadn't had a ton of success with neurologists in the past. He said, because a month ago, because this is in early April, it was published in the Annals of Neurology, a study done by Desai and others in a lab in London, funded by the British MS Society and the US MS Society. And they showed that if you give components of bacteria from the gut, so remember this leaky gut possibility. Anyway, so you're giving lipopolysaccharide, which is the part of the cell wall of the gram-negative bacteria. The key thing is to know that it's cells that have died in the gut, and these little components leak into the bloodstream because you've got holes in your gut, leaky gut, okay? And if they give this to the animals, in this case rats, they can create MS in 1 to 2 days, okay? All the symptoms of MS. And then they go on, and they of course got their control group and their working group. And if you give half of those same animals and you put them in a tank or a chamber, which is just air, but this air has been boosted, so now it's 80% oxygen. It's not hyperbaric, but it's got 80% oxygen. Close to what you can get when you see that nice mask earlier that Sandra showed you, so-called EWAT mask, or a very good free-breathing mask with good tubes. Gets near 80%. If they used that for 2 days, all the MS symptoms went away. And all the MS changes in the spinal cord went away. That was very powerful evidence that oxygen had the capability to reverse the problem that was triggered mimicking MS. So this will become the new model over the one that we've had for many years, which curiously enough also responds to get better with oxygen. And we'll get into why later. So those are the parts that I've kind of told you the pieces of it already, the side, and of course it's referenced well in the book and described in more detail. That's just for the sake of a picture for you. So this is the lining cell, or the endothelium, the red one, okay? And that's the one that gets injured. Or the places between the cells, the so-called tight junctions, can leak. The same happens in the gut lining, okay? If you get leaky tight junctions, you get a leak occurring. And I can't not take a little side menu here. Gluten you've heard of. Gluten came from the word glue in early Latin, okay? Because it does glue things. That's why it sticks things together so well. That's why we use it like a paste and wallpaper sort of idea. But the key thing about it is, when it acts on the gut, it glues those tight junctions open to leak. So you're not doing yourself any favor. G lymphatics, lots of buzz about this the last few years. This is the lymph system within the brain, okay? It does a big cleansing. It does it almost all at night when you're in proper, healthy, non-drug-induced sleep. A lot of words there, but all of them are important, okay? So lots of references about it, including the beginner's guide, quite nicely describing it. But think of this as your brain wash. It's common across species. Virtually all species, certainly all mammals, need some sleep, because this is probably when the washing occurs. It's the time when the cerebrospinal fluid is going in along beside the vessels and washing out all the toxins that have built up over the day. Some of these are the breakdown products from either the sugars or fats you're using for energy. Some of them are the herbicides, pesticides, which you had, or the heavy metals. All of those are cleaned up. And failure of that lymphatic function, that lack of cleanup occurring, can contribute to progressive or ongoing worsening of neurodegenerative diseases. So, let your system work. What interferes with it? A lot of drugs interfere with it, including non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, ibuprofen, naproxen, and so on. A lot of the central, call them psychiatric drugs, they interfere with it. All the sleeping pharmaceuticals interfere with it. Another big one that interferes with it is electromagnetic fields. Therefore, around my bed, I've got at least 2 meters, at least 6 feet, where I don't have anything electrical nearby. I don't want people to have a computer or a TV in their bedroom. In fact, I take it the extra piece in my bedroom, I turn off the breaker at night. In the area just below my bedroom, which has got a bunch of LED lights in our kitchen, I turn that breaker off, and the one upstairs in our bedroom. I'm never popular when we have guests. It really annoys the hell out of Denise, my wife, but it makes a difference. And if I have a sleep with all those things around me, I don't feel as good anymore. Okay? Not all of us need to change that, but if you really want to protect your brain long term, you should think about it. It's easy to do. Okay? So most of the time, if your cell phone's with you, have it on airplane mode, because that's a big deal. And if you think, if you've got Wi-Fi in your house, it puts out about 30,000 units a day. So turn your Wi-Fi off at night, unless you're a long ways from it in your house. The other one I hate are the hands-free phones, 5.6 or 5.8 gigahertz and stuff. They put out 50,000 units, 24/7. I only have corded phones in our house now. Most of those are fairly cheap changes to make. If you've got a huge cell tower outside your place, then do as my son did, and buy one of those coatings for it. Let's just talk about the washing. So he bought one of these, which are routine in Sweden. If you have MS, they give you one of these silver mesh screens to put over your bed and around your bed to protect you from that electromagnetic field. Europe is way ahead of us on this piece. But almost everywhere is wired these days, as you well know. And they want cell towers lots of places. So we put a chapter in the book on it. So detoxification. Of course you should avoid environmental toxins. And most of you have long since figured that out. From the days of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring on to, getting rid of DDT and 2,4-D or at least 2,4-D. We're getting it back now because we're getting weeds resistant to just Roundup. So now they're talking about putting back in 2,4-D and Agent Orange, which is a real tragedy. The one that I particularly want to mention is the glyphosate. Okay, so here's another reason to give up wheat, because almost all wheat harvested in Canada and the United States, 90% of it is harvested using Roundup as a desiccant, and it concentrates in the seed. Okay, so every time you eat something with gluten in it, wheat, you are getting a load of glyphosate. Who cares? Glyphosate messes us up. First of all, it shuts down your liver enzyme pathways, the P450 pathway system. So now you can't get rid of toxins, including drugs, to some degree, almost at all. So a small amount you're taking in becomes a big amount because the body can't get rid of it. And what's the most vulnerable part for all of these things? Unfortunately, the brain. Okay? I'm very big on saunas, chelation, exercise. We can all afford exercise, okay? Sometimes it gets harder to do. If we're extremely limited mobility, you can benefit from an infrared sauna, because that will increase the blood flow near the skin and you'll get a cardiac workout to some degree. But anything you can do to restore your energy first, because if you feel like a wet noodle, it's hard to go and exercise. I get that. I've been there. Okay? But then exercise. Anything you can do to help the exercise, whether it's oxygen while you're doing it, any of these things all make a difference. Optimal GI health, the microbiota. Yes, we did that 2.5 years ago. We followed up on it now. My wife Denise, who was a dietitian one time, master's in nutrition, under her name, we started something called Taymount Canada. So you don't have to go to Taymount in the UK, where we went in March 2016. You come to the West Coast. Now, I guess it's kind of break even whether you go to England or to Vancouver Island. But we've been running it 3 months, and we're doing it under Denise's name for obvious reasons. Political, as you might guess. Okay? Of course, excellent nutrition and fluids, attention to stress and resilience, and that means improved relationships too. If we've got a rough relationship with a parent or a spouse, we're not going to do well, because the stress is going to aggravate everything else. And of course, adequate sleep and relaxation in some variation or form. I put a chapter in the book called Meditation, Mindfulness, Gratitude, and Rotary. If you're giving back, such as Sandra Landner is so generous in giving back when they hold these conferences, if you're giving back in a part of your life, it's a part of the wellness, health, recovery journey. So I already talked about the GMO. The GMO foods that you don't recognize also are potatoes and sweet potatoes, and both of the sugars, cane and beet, because all of those are harvested with the same. They're not GMO foods per se, but they're harvested with the desiccant Roundup. And so they're rough on you. So those are ones, grow your own, that's the least expensive, or get organic, or trust somebody who grows it. And it, of course, it changes the microbiome because in 2010, Monsanto patented glyphosate or Roundup as an antibiotic. So you don't think you should take as many antibiotics? Change what you're putting in your mouth. It deactivates vitamin D3, which is a critically important thing, and I already talked about the detox problem. So this is the sheet. This is actually my son's bedroom down in Costa Rica, but they bought the material and made these around there. So even if they're in somewhere, apartment, wherever you are, if you put this around, then you could dramatically reduce at least while you're sleeping. If you're doing that, you're getting that washing of the brain at night. So well worth what? Something to think about, and I think the state provides these for people with MS in Sweden. Okay, and here's the final one talking about vascular issues. They did a study in women, and if people had a more diverse gut microbiome, meaning more kinds and diverse many types of bacteria, then they had less vascular injury, which they measured as arterial stiffness. A stiffer artery is not a healthy artery. A stiff artery is likened to hardening in the arteries. Same idea, okay? Whether you call it atherosclerosis or whatever name you use, but this made a difference. This just came out and made a shear. The hottest thing in the literature these days is what the microbiome might do for you. This is another one on ALS now, and the circulating endotoxins. I mentioned lipopolysaccharide or LPS earlier when I was talking about the triggering that they did in Dr. Desai's research in the lab with MS, the new method. And that's where it comes from, and it's also found increased in Alzheimer's. Okay? So they're all tying together quite nicely. Anything that creates more gut problems, or gut dysbiosis, meaning not healthy growing, contributes to neuroinflammation. Remember, two things about MS, even the neurologists agree on: too much inflammation and an injured blood-brain barrier. And then they've got the direct causal link. This is 2017, scientific reports. And here's an interesting study that they teased out of Europe. A very clever woman researched vagotomy. So I'm pretty long in the tooth. When I finished medical school, if you had a peptic ulcer or an ulcer of the duodenum or stomach, then they went in surgically, made a lot of general surgeons busy, okay, and they cut the vagus nerve. Okay? They cut the vagus nerve because that reduces the acid production in the stomach. Okay? They used to call it a vagotomy in pyloroclasty. That just means a reshaping of the path of the stomach. They found that that almost eliminated in that group the risk of Parkinson's. So how could that be? Well, the vagus nerve, as I knew it as an anesthesiologist, was my friend or challenging partner, whatever way you want to look at it, but it took messages all the time from the brain down to the gut, the heart. Some of you will remember the term the vagus. When you're nausea and vomiting, it's usually overactivity of the vagus nerve or the parasympathetic system. So we calm that down. But what we know now is different, because now we know that the vagus nerve is a superhighway. It goes both ways. It takes messages up to the brain, and it brings messages down. Not just down the way I naively thought. It's also a highway for bacteria. Okay? So that's pretty interesting. And if you take the other piece that we now know, before you get Parkinson's, 10 to 12 years prior, you usually have constipation. Okay? So if you're getting constipation, it's new onset, can't figure out why, personal suggestion is have a gut flora transplant and change your diet. And for sure, get off glyphosate, okay? Because it's that certain groups of bacteria that injure the motor neurons of the gut. So if you injure the motor neuron of the gut lining, it doesn't do the movement through, we call it peristalsis, but it doesn't move the stool and food and components on through the way it should. It seems to take about a decade, but eventually those same bacteria that are causing the problem in the gut travel up to the brain, and now they cause the motor neuron problem in the brain, and you get your troubles with Parkinson's. Whether that's tremor, or that's inability to walk, or the certain shuffling gaits, or all the other components. And they went on to confirm that there was direct evidence of Parkinson's pathology spread from the gut to the brain. This is another study they did on Parkinson's, 72 people with it, and 72 without, and they had a particular bacteria. But that particular bacteria helps create thiamine, vitamin B, and folate, which are very critical in your health, in all of us, because they're a very big vascular factor. I think I've talked about these pretty much already. You don't want low microbiome diversity, you want broad diversity. Simplest way to do that, aim to eat 50 different foods per week. Okay? So you got to be a little conscientious. Spices count. Tea counts for one, coffee counts for one, but if you eat beef steak, beef hamburger, or beef roast, it's still just one. Okay, so I've talked to you about the blood-brain barrier and how do the two interact. Now, I've already given you a clue that if you have leakage through a leaky gut from an injured microbiome or group of bacteria, it can injure the brain itself, okay, because it moves through the brain. It can also alter through things that it puts into the blood, small molecules, without being pieces of bacteria themselves. And many of these things, including the short-chain fatty acids, are able to cross the blood-brain barrier and affect brain function. So FMT helps MS constipation. This is a brilliant guy, Thomas Barodi, an Australian gastroenterologist, about retirement now. 20 years ago, he took 3 MS patients. So what's a gastroenterologist doing seeing him? Well, they had terrible constipation. He's a clever man. He said, I'm going to give them, at that time we called it fecal microbial transplant. I don't think there was any marketing people in the room when they picked that. So now we call it gut flora transplant. Okay? A little easier to handle, or tell your friends that you're going to have it done. Okay, anyway, 2 of the 3 people went from wheelchair to walking, and we're still walking 20 years later. Okay? So it's one of the pieces of the puzzle. MS people, and we know this is researched and in articles multiple now, reduced diversity of their microbiome, reduced number of some of the commensals. So these are kind of the helper bacteria, okay, that keep the other ones healthy and well. There's a few bacteria groups in excess of normal. And if you're going to do anything to test your gut microbiome, don't bother doing culture and sensitivity. Most of the gut or poop components die as soon as they contact the air. They can't handle any oxygen. They're anaerobic. So if you're going to name those 10 bacteria and 9 of them died, and you were going to culture them out, you're not going to culture them out because they already died. So you're only going to see the ones that happen to survive with a bit of oxygen. So it's a waste of time in most cases. The only time it might be helpful to you is if you've got C. difficile, because that's the only thing in Canada we will provide payment for GFT or gut flora transplant. think we've covered that one. Covered this as well. I think the big thing here, well, is that in Parkinson's, they can take the poop from a Parkinson's patient, put it into a healthy, no bacteria in the gut mouse, and give Parkinson's symptoms. Is that real? Okay? Anything that injures the blood-brain barrier or contributes to it is a problem. Okay? So that's herbicides, pesticides, heavy metals, or hypoxic episodes. Okay? Anything that would give you a hypoxic episode will be a problem. So there's a host of things that you may not realize, but when you have a traumatic brain injury or a concussion, there's a great pruning happens to parts of the brain. So some parts of the brain lose their blood flow. Usually there's still enough energy left to keep those neurons alive, but now they can't function. Consequently, they're having a hypoxic event because they're not getting flow, therefore they're not getting oxygen. This could be one of the early triggers of some of us in MS. And if I ask carefully, and I talk about this in the book, if I ask carefully, many of my MS clients have had something. And some of them will even volunteer. I seem to get it 3 months, 6 months after such and such event. No small question. We know we don't need our count of chlorines. What we do when we do GFT, because I'm talking mostly to physicians and they've still got in the literature FMT. So anyway, we do a stool softener ahead of time with magnesium. Magnesium is the most common thing I use. MS patients with terrible constipation, we use magnesium sulfate. It's cheap, Epsom salts, 1/4 to 1/2 a teaspoon, and it's like dynamite the next morning. Okay? That everybody can afford. So we clean the colon out ahead of time with 2 colonic irrigations, which is an unregulated phenomenon all across the country. It's very safe. The major centers that are doing colonoscopy now, some of them are having them cleaned out with colonic irrigation first, and then they get a better colonoscopy. Well, physicians and power and scheduling, this isn't happening very fast in Canada. Okay, you want to have healthy donors, and that's why in the facility that my wife runs, she gets all the implants from the UK, and they're the only place on the planet that does the testing day 1 when they collect the stool, and then again 3 months later. And while that stool is spun down and frozen, they don't use any of those samples until the second 3 months is clear of viruses. Because some of the nasty viruses can grow slowly. You'll get them in 3 months, but you could miss one of the infectious hepatitises on the way or HIV on the way. And most people don't. And this isn't something that you should do at home. I know a fellow in Calgary, if people brought their own donor, they would get their own and they'd do it at home. Then my colleagues wondered, do they use the same blender or whatever? So the mind boggles. You don't actually have to have the poop. They can centrifuge all the poop out now. And they can centrifuge out all the human epithelial cells. So virtually you're only getting the bacteria, fungi, and single cell organisms. So it's much better. And so then they do 1 a day for 2 weeks, 10 implants, send 2 home to the client. This is another study, and this showed where MS people changed their diet. Okay? They improved their diversity of their gut microbiome, and they reduced their symptoms. Okay? So that's in almost everybody's purview or ability. Okay? Homocysteine, I couldn't not talk about it. Some of you have heard of MTHFR. So homocysteine is the body's transition. So one of the essential amino acids we take in is methionine, which is a sulfur-containing amino acid. The body converts it first to homocysteine, and then, if it has enough B6, B12, and folate, preferably methylfolate, it can convert it into cysteine. Cysteine, as you'll read about, is in whey protein, but the body can make it, but it must have enough of those. 25% of us don't have the enzyme to make that super well. You can see this in genetic testing now, okay? And so they need more B6, B12, folic acid, or better, methylfolate. I'm one of those, so is my wife. 5 or 6% of people are missing 2 genes that do that well, so they need much more. These people usually can't sleep, all these other related problems. My friend Michael Arata, he's in that group, okay? As soon as he started taking B6, B12, and methylfolate, he could sleep. Dramatic. And homocysteine is a huge vascular factor, so ideally you would keep it under 7. The norm in this country is usually 12 or 13 for the cardiovascular risk factor, because it's used as a cardio risk factor 20, 30 years. If it goes too high, and you have a heart attack of unknown reason, that's what triggered it. A lot of data out of the United Kingdom talks about if it gets, you can cut your Alzheimer's risk in half by keeping the homocysteine low. And you can do that for pennies a day, because it's very effective in vascular dysfunction, neurodegenerative disease, and even that hated word, but that's what he used in the article, autoimmune. Okay, mitochondrial nutrition cofactors, I alluded to these earlier. The big thing about them is they can make a big difference to getting you restarted again. You can find out why. There's lots of things injure the mitochondria. One of the important ones is hypoxia. Make sure you don't have hemochromatosis. It's more common in people of Irish descent. I don't have it, but make sure somebody who knows what they're doing tests you for it, because it has lots of problems. One of the ones is iron fist of the hand, but it's easy to treat. Just quit eating iron and you get your blood drawn frequently. C-reactive protein is another way that everybody could be tested to see what is their background inflammation in the body. Most of my MS patients, it's above 10, okay? I'd like it under 1. You can't lose with regular exercise. As I quote in the book, the best value in medicine is exercise. It's taken me a long time. I'm 65, but by my 64th year, I was exercising 3 to 5 days a week. After listening to a woman talk brilliant about Parkinson's the other day, 7's better. So I'm aiming for that. If you take nothing else away and you want to learn about Alzheimer's, get Dale Brederson's book. I talk about the components in mind. This is a neurologist and a researcher, and all of the solutions that got people better in his Alzheimer's group weren't drugs at all. They were the things his integrative medicine wife practiced in her practice. Hyperbaric oxygen, this is a study done in 1983 in New York State. Incredibly well done, double-blind controlled trial, reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, and showed that it made a difference, okay? And that's when they started. They've got 60 units for hyperbaric oxygen all around the UK. I'm not naive enough as a Canadian to think that we're going to achieve that here, but instead, everybody with MS, or migraine headaches, or a neurologic illness, or a stroke previous, should have their home oxygen concentrator. Okay? I can tell you places where you can order those. Most of the time, you will need a physician's prescription. If you have a non-consenting physician, that's unfortunate, but we can suggest where else to go, or you can go to, well, we call it used Victoria. I don't know if you're going to use Halifax online here or not, but I'm sure you have something akin to it, Kijiji or otherwise. They're often available there because people with end-stage lung disease pass away, and all of a sudden, the family sells it for very little because they don't know what to do with it. Most of them will run for 40,000 hours, so they've still got lots of good value left in them. And that's how I think Canadians can cope with many of their mental health diseases. Your odds of going into the emergency room and getting, for a migraine headache or for MS, getting oxygen slapped on you is almost nil. They say that your oxygen saturation on the pulse oximeter is 96, 98, and you don't need it. What they don't realize is that number is what's happening at your fingertip. It doesn't tell you what's happening in that vulnerable, at-risk part of the brain. The other important thing is the oxygen doesn't get to the cell with the red blood cell attached to hemoglobin. It gets near the cell, and then the oxygen has to let go of the hemoglobin, travel through the fluid of the blood, or the plasma, through the endothelium, and through the fluid around the cell, and then get into the cell. So the most critical piece is what is the dissolved oxygen concentration in that blood vessel. And we know if it isn't high enough, and you'll get the same, that's what causes altitude sickness, there isn't enough left for the neurons to function. And they shut down. And that's what happens in MS all the time. If you're into superb books, they're quite chewy, Philip James, now a close friend of mine in Dundee, Scotland, wrote this superb book, and he and I and a vascular surgeon are now writing another one on oxygen and MS only. But there isn't anything else like it out there. This is an absolute game changer and should be one of the critical textbooks in medical schools. But that's not going to happen because there's too much push on the pharmaceutical side for building buildings and whatever. So that's an inexpensive mask, okay? Not quite as optimal as the large tubing components in the one that Sam showed you. But it gives you the idea, okay? Because while you're breathing out, the oxygen coming from this tube fills the plastic bag. Because you breathe in faster than it can be supplied through the little tube, okay? But you can have that little tube in a bedroom elsewhere. The machine's all the way somewhere. Okay? But I use mine, I don't use it with the mask, I use it with the nasal specs on an airplane. Part of the reason I was able to fly yesterday for 8-9 hours to get here was I used oxygen supplement the whole way. A little paperwork involved, but it's worth it. So this is by Edward Teller. He's one of the fellows that developed the hydrogen bomb, brilliant physicist. And I'll let you read it for yourself. But the short story is, if you're going to work till you're 95, he does oxygen 6 days a week. Excellent. And, so it's quite important. And that has it. Okay? Thank you. Sorry, one more thing. I did bring a couple of props I didn't show you, but I know everybody's got access to cannabis now because we've had October 17th. But this is one that's from one of the licensed producers because we've had medical marijuana in Canada since 2001. Okay? So you just take a small amount of that oil in there, put it under your tongue, or if you don't like that, then you can use a little spray. The physicians, this is now in 26 countries around the world. It's called Sativex, S-A-T-I-V-E-X. But a spray under the tongue could eliminate about 4 MS drugs.
So any questions for Dr. Code? Go ahead.
I'm wondering if you know of Bruno Gerling. He's
Bernie Gerling.
no, Bruno is
Okay.
his first name.
All right.
He was born in Germany,
Mm-hmm.
and the stories you're telling are very much like what he writes about. He would go into a room kind of unannounced, and all of a sudden the patient was cured.
Okay.
And he would prescribe all the kinds of things that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this is happening, it's a little slower happening in Canada, the United States, in some parts of the world, and we're ahead of a few. But some places are light years ahead of us on this. The better being hospital in Bangkok, Thailand.
Yeah.
You know, he does this quite aggressively and other people do, and that's why I comment that all these choices, like we're trying to develop, I didn't even mention photobiomodulation or cool laser today, but all of these choices, we're trying to create a destination center on the West Coast where we live, because people need to have access to these. And the downside is, yes, you'll need to pay out of pocket for them. So the upside of that is you don't get the roadblock of your doctor saying, I won't do that. You get to do your own destiny. At the back.
Then you made mention of if you're on particular drugs that you should be balanced off with other drugs. So for example, I get cesarean infusions or something that I'm supposed to be on. That
So-
balances it off. I thought you said something.
Which infusion?
Cesarean.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I thought you said something about on particular drugs so that you may be on for MS, that there's other medication that is supposed to, you should be on.
Well,
I thought you mentioned something, maybe I caught it wrong.
so Tysabri is a straightforward one. We've had it about 10 years, maybe 12, okay? We pulled it a year or two after we first got it because we realized it was dangerous. Created CML, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Yes.
And yet we keep using it. And we've had, you know, nearly 100 deaths worldwide. Any other drug, we wouldn't make a difference. It makes people feel different. It makes the MRI look different. But I don't think we've got one shred of evidence that it reduces one's mobility or loss of mobility. Okay? So I think it's a dangerous drug, personally.
So
That's my opinion.
What should you be on then?
Well,
That's what your neurologist.
what I'm suggesting, well, no, this, everybody has to walk their own personal journey. In my journey, I have chosen, I rarely see a neurologist, okay? Because mostly they're gonna insist I go on drugs. Drugs are a risk factor, I don't wanna walk down there. My sister with MS was on Copaxone for 8 years, but she hasn't been on it for 10, at least. You know, that's one of the old ones, injectable, okay? But we need to decide ourselves what we do. If we're going to worship, because it's almost like that, at the role of regular medicine, then you're gonna have to stay on Tysabri. Full stop. The other game they play, they say, well, if you don't take the medicines I recommend, I'm not gonna do any more MRIs for you. That's a common card they play. That's effectively blackmail. And it's just nonsense. But it's also nonsense in that there is zero value to you to having a repeated MRI. Because how you are doing yourself clinically is a much better predictor than what the MRI says. The MRI can look like a whiteout and you're still walking and doing pretty well. Or it can have almost 2 or 3 lesions and you're devastated.
So how do you take those steps?
Well, you take them gradually one at a
I'm on
time.
24 pills a day.
Yeah.
Plus cesarean infusions once a month. I don't want to be on 24
Yeah.
pills per day. I don't feel like who I am or who I was. How do I, under the medical system, reduce or stop?
Yeah,
those
well,
drugs?
I mean, you are in control of your body. It's not your doctor's, it's yours. I mean, this is almost a philosophical discussion, but it's true. And if you take baby steps, all the baby steps I've talked about, you can do simultaneously while you're doing the other. And then you can decide which one you're going to taper off first. Some of them you can quit almost cold turkey, some of them you've got to taper. Because the body has been bathed in that drug so long it's addicted to it, effectively, whether it's a Valium family, clonazepam is a common one, and it's just deadly. But there's a chapter on the point of return because it takes people gradually off it.
Thank you.
It's not easy, I get that, but it's doable. And to recognize you're in control is the most important.
But they should be careful about weaning themselves off the medications. I think it's worthwhile
Yeah.
mentioning that perhaps having a conversation with your doctor would be a good idea.
Well, absolutely. But get yourself well first with all the other methods I've talked about, all right? And that I talk about in the book. As you continue to be, I hope, improved health, you're going to get more cooperation with your physician. But as you taper a drug, everybody's got to be on side. In some of these drugs, they only make one size. Not by accident, it's so you get rebound or withdrawal if you even miss a dose. You don't get 12 sizes so you could gradually come down 10% a week. But your physician can write a compounding pharmacy prescription to taper it. So they should be in the game. They're still your team player. You need them on your side if you get unlucky, break your leg or whatever. Chronic illness is not their mainstay though. 80% of illness is chronic, lots of it's the brain, and we're doing a terrible job at the moment. Okay, probably want to get going.
Actually, I do, but Matthew has.
Sorry, just a
Yes,
question.
ma'am.
So two things. What's your opinion on Copaxone, and what's your sister's treatment now that she's gone off it?
Yeah. My sister pretty much follows the same treatment I do. She hasn't done GFT, and she hasn't done the oxygen route, but she's been very good about being the gluten-free piece and her exercise. Okay? She's been off Copaxone more than 10, 12 years. She was very keen I get on it because she was diagnosed a few years before I was. I went to see my neurologist and he said, Bill, you're doing well enough, I wouldn't put you on it. So I thank him for that because he was pretty broad-minded. I think Copaxone is the least of all the evils. Okay? If you're going to take one of them, that's the better one. But the same data exists. Zero difference to your long-term disability.
So now, what was her, I guess, ease off phase when she came off?
She went off cold turkey, and it's usually fine for this kind of agent, okay? Because she was having to take an antihistamine and or a steroid before she did each injection because her body was allergically reacting to it for about a year, so it was easy right away, so to speak.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Last question, sorry. We
One
have
more.
questions at the end.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Bill, for all the work that you've done over the past number of years and starting to break down some of these doors into Sandra and Landon and Bernie, also the work that you've all done. But there are roadblocks. You're in the medical profession. For somebody who's not in the medical profession, to try and break down those doors becomes more and more difficult. And we know the study that was done recently on CCSVI, I think anybody who had done any study whatsoever knew what the result would be when the study was announced. It was set up for failure so that it would be, yes, it doesn't work. And I can tell you on Parliament Hill, it was just pouring cold water over the whole discussion of CCSVI and MS, and it would not have been productive at all to bring it up again, as
Oh, I
Kirsty and I
think it
had done. But are you seeing any doors opening? I mean, you spoke about Europe earlier, but what about within Canada and the United States? Is it starting to happen?
You mean with regard to angioplasty?
Well, regarding
IUDs.
different non-prescription
Yeah.
solutions.
I think there's starting to be a better acceptance. People are voting with their feet. They look seriously. You know, it's usually women that figure it out first. Men are live in denial most of their life, and they're nearly dead before they come up with anything. But women will look for answers, and they look for answers in someone with integrative medicine or functional medicine training. Okay? And those are getting increasingly available around the country, happily. So that is increasing. I know for a fact, I just spoke last weekend to naturopaths, over 300 of them in Vancouver. People are voting and going to a naturopath. A naturopath is a much smoother road to follow. Now, they can't prescribe all things. In some provinces, they can prescribe thyroid and a few things. But frankly, I don't prescribe any drugs other than thyroid medication, low-dose naltrexone, cannabis. Done. Because most of the others are not helpful. And I have clients, I just mentioned briefly the cannabis piece, they're not only off all opiates, which is one reason we've got to push it, because it reduces opiate deaths by 25%. That's a big deal, because those are horrific. But at the same time, it handles most of the other little problems and people can access. So we're making some inroads on that. Only 16% of physicians in Canada will write medical cannabis. That's a pretty small number, but it's not desperately small. There's got to be a couple in Halifax. Okay?
So,
So
Bill, we have to cut you off there.
changes are slow.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. On behalf of the Canadian Neurovascular Health Society, we have a small token of our appreciation. It is breakable, don't drop it. It is Nova Scotia art.
Fantastic.
So, thank you so much for